Well, good evening, everyone. It's time to start our event. And again, I'm Jeff Partridge from Capital Community College. And it's a pleasure to have everyone here tonight. We have a pretty full house here of people attending in person. And I trust that there are many people online, and there are going to be others who are watching this after the fact, because it is available both on Connecticut Old State House's Facebook and YouTube channels. and also will be airing on Connecticut Network. We want to thank the Old State House for the partnership that we have with them and for making the space available and the recording and the broadcasting and all of that. It's really fabulous to have this relationship. Capital Community College has a place-based learning initiative called the Hartford Heritage Project, which I direct. We started in 2011, and we encourage faculty to use places like the Old State House in our curriculum at Capital, to give students the opportunity to be in historic homes and historic spaces, museums, theater, and symphony, and all kinds of opportunities. So we're happy to be presenting for the fourth time, the Hartford History Lecture Series. And I've been coordinating that with Bill Hosley, with his group, the Hartford, sorry, Bill. Historic Hartford. Historic Hartford Facebook group. I'm sorry, I messed that up. But we are in the middle of our series. We've had 2 lectures so far. Bill Hosley spoke the last 2 weeks. If you missed those, you can catch those on YouTube and on Historic Hartford, also the Hartford Heritage website. So there are multiple ways of getting these broadcasts at your leisure. Next week, we're going to be doing a tour. We're not going to be meeting here on Thursday night. We're going to be doing a tour on Saturday the 13th, which is going to be a fabulous opportunity to walk through Spring Grove Cemetery in Clay Arsenal in the north part of Hartford with Bill Hosley. That will be the first half of the tour. The second half will be across the street at Faith Congregational Church. And Faith is opening their doors for us, and their history committee is going to be setting up stations so we can go around and learn about some of the important Black community figures from the 19th century that are very foundational, not only to them, but to Black community today and to Hartford community today. People like the Reverend James W.C. Pennington and others. So we hope that you'll come out for that. The last lecture that we'll have will be on November 18th, and that will be a presentation by R.J. Luke Williams, who is the archivist at the Hartford Public High School. And if you don't know anything about the history of Hartford Public High School, you won't want to miss this, because it's an amazing history, and we have the expert who's going to be coming to talk about it. So don't miss that. That's November 18th, and that will be our last in this series. So tonight we have a talk on shade tobacco stories, land, labor, and immigration in the Connecticut Tobacco Valley by Dr. Fiona Vernal of the University of Connecticut. Fiona Vernal is the Director of Engaged Public, Oral, and Community Histories and Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Her research straddles African, Caribbean, and African diaspora history. Her current book and digital humanities project, Hartford Bound: Mobility, Race, and Identity in Post-World War II Hartford, examines the convergence of 3 great migrations of African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and West Indians in the Greater Hartford region as housing policies chiseled residential segregation into the city's landscape. Hartford Bound integrates oral history, archival research, and GIS methodologies to reframe the history of how Hartford became an African American and Caribbean city. She was recently awarded the University of Connecticut's Provost Award for Excellence in Community Engaged Scholarship, and we're so privileged to have her speaking tonight. So join me in welcoming Fiona Vernal.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. We have a slight echo that I'm going to try to fix. Paul, does that work? All right. Jeff, you're much taller than I am. Everybody's taller than me. Even even my children. All right. Good evening, everyone. How's the audio? Good. All right. Thanks to Bill and Jeff for the work that you do and for inviting me to be a part of this series. I echo all of the sentiments that we have been discussing in the last two series about cultivating a sense of place, civic pride, and historical consciousness about Hartford and the Greater Hartford region. And I look forward to being a part of the conversations, whether I'm the speaker or working in the background to promote and support the work of others. Bill and Jeff are really great at doing that, and I'm glad to be able to join them. My colleagues, Elena Rosario, a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, and my colleague, Jason Oliver Chang, who is in the history department with me and Asian American studies at UConn, are among the scholars who are also interested in the topic of shade tobacco and its global reach, and in doing local community engaged work around that topic. We have established something that we call the Shade Collective, and that was begun as an initiative to generate more research, scholarship, and public programming on this topic. So on that site, you will find our recordings, our annual conference, and you can rewind and watch it at leisure in your pajamas. If you're interested in road tripping, day tripping, going on road tours, family tours, or something of the sort, you can use Brianna Dunlap's book from 2016. My slides have disappeared. There we go. So Connecticut Valley Tobacco, this book is laid out for you to use it to plan individual day trips. And if you really want to go down a rabbit hole and it's the tobacco sheds that you are interested in, you can check out Dale and Darcy Cahill's 2014 book called Tobacco Sheds, Vanishing Treasures of the Connecticut River Valley. And if you're still not satisfied and you want to check out more tobacco stories, especially beautiful imagery, Carol Highsmith a few years ago, photographer, was here to photograph the landscape, and she has donated all of her, well, not just of tobacco, but all of her photography, copyright free, to the Library of Congress. So you can check out her photography collection for those of you who are really and deeply interested in shade tobacco. Finally, a special thanks to Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter, that went to great lengths during the pandemic to provide access to the archival materials from the Puerto Rican Migration Division. Elena and I have gone through 5,000 pages of that archive, and it's only because of the pandemic. It's only because of the pandemic permissions that we were able to do that when the archives were closed to many other people. So we really, really appreciate that. All right, so that's it for the thanks. Tobacco stories are ubiquitous. Many folks have worked in tobacco, and many others from throughout the Northeast and the South have done a stint. Perhaps you hear people talking about when they were youth laborers or college laborers, or when they spent a season or a summer in tobacco. Shade tobacco has also been in the news. Issues of preservation, open land, the pressures of development, especially along 91, have been featured in our local news coverage as one tobacco shed after another disappears and as land is sold off. There's a little bit of romance around it. There's a little bit of sadness around it. We know that perhaps as soon as the land is sold off, if it doesn't turn into another, get turned over to another crop, there'll probably be like a hotel or a dollar store, God forbid, that replaces this landscape. Just a few weeks ago, in a really exciting piece of news, the Trust for Public Land and the town of Simsbury held their ribbon cutting for their efforts to preserve part of the farm where Dr. Martin Luther King did his stint as a tobacco worker when he was just 15, and then again when he was 18. And so anything connected to Dr. King is going to get a lot of attention and mileage, and I think it's really great for everyone to pay attention to what is going on in their local communities and explore its connections to the past and the broader issues. And so Dr. King's connections help us to do that, and I think Connecticut goes hog wild and is really excited to lay any claim that they are part of the making of Dr. Martin Luther King. That the tobacco experience is ubiquitous and familiar, and that Dr. King spent 2 summers here in 1944 and in 1947 are really great entry points, and that's about the last you're going to hear of them today. My entry points are the thousands of Caribbean workers, primarily Puerto Ricans and British West Indians, who have been laboring in tobacco and who continue to labor in tobacco. In the last 2 lectures, Bill gave us a really deep dive into Hartford as a local treasure, an insular and really intimate portrait of the city and why it matters for so many of the narrative threads in American history. My talk looks at Greater Hartford from another perspective, a vantage point that places Hartford in a broader regional context in Connecticut and in New England, and in the global circuits of labor that are also a crucial part of the making of America. So when Dr. King spent his 2 summers here, 2 things were readily apparent. First, he always had his eyes set on college. Second, this was going to be a temporary experience, an expedient way to save up some money and help to defray some of the expenses of going to college. This was not going to be his lifetime's work. And so this reminds us, on the one hand, that working as a migrant laborer or as a seasonal laborer hardly tells us much about the dreams that people harbor. And while we know Dr. King's escape hatch for his dreams as a young Black man, so many of the people who labored in tobacco had to continue in tobacco. And in doing so, they had to navigate the structural systems of labor and capital that kept them circulating, that kept them vulnerable and embedded in agricultural labor. Meanwhile, their representatives were negotiating every year for better pay, better working conditions, and better living conditions. By way of a quick background, a lot of you are quite familiar with this history, but just as a way of a background, by 1910, after many experiments, shade tobacco became an important part of the Connecticut River Valley, as opposed to broadleaf. There was competition from the 1890s with the Sumatran tobacco leaf that prompted the search for the seed varieties that would make shade famous and that could meet the demands of the market. So in the literature, I have never smoked tobacco, so I know nothing about this, and I probably won't, but the literature talks about the texture, the burn, the color, and the size that helps to carve out a niche for shade tobacco to be used as premium cigar leaves. And about 77 to 87%, so from 1910, about 77 to 87% of the total New England crop that is grown in Connecticut, that is grown in New England, 77 to 87% of the New England crop was grown in Connecticut specifically, with smaller percentages than in Western Mass and Southern Vermont. And the Vermont industry went belly up in the 1950s. So given the conversations that we're having now in our current moment about how hard it is to find workers, imagine a situation where labor shortage is just routine. That's what you worry about every year from one season to the next. So in addition to too much rain or too little rain, hurricanes, for example, that have happened here, shade tobacco growers, anyone who was interested in entering the industry had to worry constantly about who was going to harvest for them. The labor bottlenecks that plagued this industry were based on all of the work that required you to touch this crop 15 times. It is one of the most intensive, labor-intensive crops. So in addition to the work that's required for netting, for preparing the soil at just the right depth for planting, weeding, chopping off the blooms to give the plant a little bit more room to grow, picking off leaves at different intervals, and all of the other steps, therefore, after harvesting, you end up with a significant problem that growers were facing in 1910 when they got really excited about this initiative, and that they are experiencing right now. Between 1919, so this amateur chart here, and the 1940s, the shade crop hovered somewhere between $4 and $5 million on average. The middle of the war saw the value increase to between 10 and 13 million, but values also went up as high as 22 million. These figures are just for shade. If you include broadleaf, and if you include tobacco production elsewhere in Connecticut, we're talking about $30+ million. And so despite the labor bottlenecks, despite the constant worry, it was actually really profitable for the shade tobacco growers. The 1940s in particular were boom years for the industry. There is a lot of sort of public service campaigns to include tobacco in the messaging about how we need to help the troops to feel good and cheer them on. And so that was part of a major boom. And then the bust period is coming in the 1970s. So we have 1940s major boom, and then by the 1970s, things have tapered off. And by tapering off, to give you a sense of how it's tapering off where we have about 300 farmers, and then by the 1970s, it's 50 farmers, and then they're fewer and fewer. Now, I want to focus on the 1940s when we have a major boom, and I'm going to end in the 1970s because we only have about 20 minutes left. Under Ralph Lasberry, who is becomes the executive director of the Shade Tobacco Growers Association in 1942, we have a really robust and almost singular personality in somebody who can really get things done and can really pull the growers together, who can speak to Washington and who can also talk to all kinds of other growers across the other country. Those 5,000 pages that I mentioned from the archives have a lot of his correspondence as well as his successors, and you can tell by going through the archives that he was just a singular personality. He was able to cultivate this deep respect for everyone involved, whether he was talking to federal officials or whether he was scolding Coleman Brothers for being the worst in terms of its abuses of workers and even threatening to kick them out of the association, or speaking with British West Indian labor liaisons and Puerto Rican labor liaisons about concrete things that can be done to improve the issues that workers were complaining about. So far in 5,000 pages, I haven't seen anybody who kind of stands out the way that Mr. Lasberry does. He was an insider. He had extensive experience in the industry. His own family was a part of the industry. He had worked tobacco himself, and when he left tobacco, he went on to actually establish the Connecticut regional market, which a lot of you guys go to. So during the 1940s, the growers argued convincingly that they had to secure temporary foreign agricultural workers to ease the manpower shortages during World War II. The argument was an attempt to get around a 1917 immigration policies that had completely banned the recruitment of foreign workers for employment, but it had a little loophole, and it gave the Attorney General and the Secretary of Labor some discretion, and they could approach INS Immigration and Naturalization Services, now ICE, for a waiver if those workers had special skills. This is really interesting because you have the AG and the Secretary of Labor making really lofty claims about the value of agricultural labor. They make very lofty claims about the value of domestic agricultural labor, but this time they're making very lofty claims about the value of foreign agricultural labor. This particular move on the growers is really important for understanding this moment and what it means for not just Connecticut, but for New England. During the 1940s, with Mr. Lasberry's help, the shade tobacco growers are able to help New England and New England states to actually compete with growers out west. They're able to get a foothold in the agricultural guest worker program without relying on Mexico. And this is a huge deal. And this is really important because farmers who only need a handful of workers, if you need 3 people or 5 people, they have no mechanism for getting Mexican laborers. The labor recruiters will not talk to them. It is not worth their time to try to secure 5 or 6 or 10 or even sometimes 80 laborers for you. It's just not profitable for them to do so. And so it's also important because as much as I have moved beyond my slides, as much as it was acknowledged that Mexico was the behemoth, here are some Mexican workers who are coming in to the country in the 1940s. As much as they acknowledge that Mexico is the behemoth, there's nothing to be done about it. They simply have a massive pool of labor. And so Mr. Lasberry would write things like, the State Department tells you we need Mexico's oil, we need this in case of war, we give them everything they want. They don't give New England much of anything. But the growers, the shade tobacco growers, are able to build on this strategy that they are very successful at in saying that they want a temporary agricultural labor supply. They get all of the waivers from the AG and the Secretary of Labor. They secure West Indians, they secure Puerto Ricans. And after the program is over, they use that advocacy to say, please continue the program because New England farmers need it and they're never going to be able to be properly supplied by Mexico. It is a successful program. That same program from the 1940s continues to today, and they've now expanded it so that if you need someone to clean your hotel on Cape Cod, the hospitality industry, you can use that same program to get workers. And so it's really important, even after tobacco, now that tobacco is in decline, that we understand that there are lots of other legacies besides what's going to happen to the land and whether we're able to preserve it. We need to understand that there are also legacies about how we deal with labor, the labor needs of New England, and how that brings in people from different parts of the world, and whether those people choose to make Connecticut their home or New England when they get here. So the growers in the beginning would accept workers from anywhere. So yes, to Mexicans, if they could get them, West Indians, lots of Canadians as well. A little later, they tried to be more discerning and they looked around at what happened during wartime. And they were asking some really crucial questions. How reliable is the Canadian labor supply? For example, Mexico is a little bit too far. There are way too many transportation issues. Puerto Ricans are going to give us some problems because they are Americans after all. And you could see in these archival documents this deep commitment to West Indians as they're biased as the best laborers, but as the most deportable laborers as well. And it's been really interesting to go through the archives and to look at the way that the various growers try to achieve a level of cultural competency at first, and they make a lot of concessions during the wartime and even in the immediate post-war period. Somebody sort of brought in like 10 pigs to be slaughtered so that Puerto Ricans could enjoy on a Saturday. They tried to permit folks to maybe bring in guests on the farm so that they wouldn't be so lonely. They invited social work agencies to come to the farms. And then eventually they stepped back from those and settled on, we want deportable labor. That is ultimately, we want folks whose country we can negotiate with. So the British West Indian islands, both before independence and after dependence. And we want absolute and complete leverage in that situation. And so I'm going to end a little bit later on by talking about what that leverage really means and what that means for the workers and where they're able to find a bit of agency. And so the migrations from Puerto Rico and the migrations from the British West Indies are playing a really important role that a lot of folks don't also talk about. So in the Jamaican archives, this is what you see, a discussion of squalor, poverty, and hunger. In the Puerto Rican archives, you see a lot of discussion of unemployment and the fact that 60,000 Puerto Ricans would have to leave the island every year if the island is going to be economically secure. Like, that's how many people were unemployed and they needed an escape valve for all of those 60,000 peoples. And so I do want to emphasize that the program plays a really important role in both the Puerto Rican economy and the British West Indian economy, especially while the US and other economies are experiencing boom times. There is a lot of squalor and poverty and hunger and unemployment. The war completely disrupted the tourist trade to the Caribbean. It completely disrupted the banana trade, which is the major commodity and source of US dollars. And so everyone is looking to this labor program for their answers. And I think I would go as far as to say that these labor programs play a really important role in preventing unrest in those countries, because it gives the government a little bit of political gravitas to say that we've been able to find employment for you and you can earn some US dollars. And the governments there also emphasize that it's supposed to be temporary. And so the British West Indians arrived for the first time in 1943, and the Puerto Ricans arrived in 1948. One thing I forgot to say was that while there are all of these folks talking about poverty in the Caribbean, there's a lot of opponents who are talking about poverty in the US, and that these guest worker programs is going to continue to create a race to the bottom for local workers in the United States. Puerto Ricans complicate that a bit, but for the Puerto Rican government, this is a really important part of their overall political and economic strategy. When British West Indians are distributed in the US when they first arrive, they end up in 24 states. And the Shade Tobacco Growers Association is able to take credit for that. And so one of the things about the Growers Association is that they punch far above their weight. The kind of labor, recruitment, advocacy, PR work that they're doing is not just about tobacco. It's also about apples. It's also about sugarcane. It's also about securing workers for warehouses. It's also about the canning industry, right? They are lending and sending workers to Wisconsin, to Michigan, and everyone is relying on the skills of Mr. Lasbury to make the case that you need workers in Michigan, you need workers in Florida, you need workers in Wisconsin, and you end up having West Indians all over the place. At its peak, West Indians in 1943, there's about 8,000 workers who come, and then another 17,000, another 20,000, another 12,000, another 4,000, just between 43 and 47. What the growers are also able to do at this time is make the case for why these workers should be allowed to just stay for as long as the war effort is going on. And so it's not as if the 8,000 who come, they don't go back and are then succeeded by another 17,000. In fact, most of these men who come in 43 to 47, they don't end up going home until 1950. They're able to stay on, and they get sent everywhere. They get sent to Delaware. They get sent to Pennsylvania, wherever farmers want to borrow laborers to harvest tobacco, to work in harvesting fruit. The growers are able to navigate those relationships and send the workers all over the place. This plays a really important role in introducing West Indian workers to a wide range of growers, and then a similar process ensues. So West Indians are here 43 to 47. The Puerto Ricans joined them in 48 and then eventually succeed them. Most of the West Indians have to go back home in the 1950, and Mr. Lasbury goes back to negotiating with DC for the post-war extension of the program. He is incredibly successful. The British West Indian program continues, gets a continuance after the 1950s. It's always in the shadow of the Mexican program, the Bracero program. In the private correspondence, you'll see Mr. Lasbury lament time and time again that the Mexican program is giving the rest of the programs a really bad name. But there's nothing he can do about Mexico. It's just a behemoth. Tobacco work becomes a space for West Indian, Puerto Rican, and African American men to negotiate their labor power. But they have a lot of different kinds of people who are determining their roles and trying to speak on their behalf. And these officials are in Puerto Rico, in Bahamas, in Jamaica, in DC. They're in all of these other states where workers are sent. They're in the regional labor offices in the capital. And these conversations are taking place for the most part without the men, because in these conversations between the officials, wage rates are set, policies for transportation, food, and housing are set. African American and Puerto Rican workers are described as loafers, gamblers, drinkers, and perhaps worst of all, they're able to strike. That was the worst thing. They might be able to accept them as loafers, drinkers, and gamblers, but they're able to strike. That's the worst thing about them. And because they're able to exercise these rights, a lot of the growers just don't want to deal with them. So at play are negotiations for Puerto Ricans as Americans who are pitted against domestic workers, Puerto Ricans pitted against West Indian workers, British West Indians who are pitted against African American workers, and everybody sort of racing to the bottom by trafficking and all kinds of racial and ethnic stereotyping. The ethnic stereotype that remains as a legacy, and that is still causing problems in the guest worker program, is that whether they're picking apples or whether they're cutting sugarcane or whether they're working in tobacco, the West Indian workers are constantly messing it up for everybody else. They work faster, they pick more apples, then whatever they accomplish becomes the norm the next season. And so in oral histories with West Indians, for example, and with African Americans, there's this like constant battle that on the one hand, just by being a guest worker, they're undercutting domestic American workers, but then their working habits also undercuts them. And the West Indian workers remind the African American workers that they're ultimately deportable and that their work ethic is the only thing that gives them leverage, and that would make, apple growers in upstate New York want to use them, or for the shade tobacco growers to continue using them. Because the power to deport and to enclose in camps and to surveil workers and to blacklist those who went back home early, refused to work, complained about working conditions, or tried to engage in collective bargaining. From the growers' perspective, these were the only assurances that they could give to those who were talking about the general poverty of American workers. Those were the only assurances that they could give that would get these programs to pass. And so after the war, Lasbury goes back and fights the battle anew. And this time he has a huge cabal, a huge coalition of folks. It's Connecticut, Florida, New Jersey, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Virginia, West Virginia, New York, and then all of the New England states. They all converge, all of the representatives of the growers, they all converge in New York, and they decide to form a British West Indian Central Labor Organizing Association, where as users of West Indian labor, they would all meet and try to make sure that they didn't undercut each other, because they firmly believed that the folks out in, especially the California growers who use Mexican workers, were undercutting them specifically. For the next 20 years, this success would dictate the rhythms of shade tobacco. And so every season, West Indian workers came, and every season, Puerto Rican workers came. Sometimes it was 5,000, sometimes it was 7,000, depending on what was going on with the crop. The growers would submit their paperwork to the Department of Labor for however many workers they need, and they would go and meet the plane on Bradley Field when the recruitment had been done. They leave the recruitment to the various officers in Puerto Rico and various officers in Jamaica. And it's on that side, especially on the Jamaican side, you get a ticket, you get called, you go to a school sometimes, you have a physical exam, and then you wait for the telegram to say that you've been selected. Something similar happens in Puerto Rico. And in this way, hundreds of communities across Puerto Rico, hundreds of communities across Jamaica, especially, like 80% of the workers are from Jamaica specifically, come to learn about Connecticut. And they're, other than the folks who just gave up on it being too cold, and what they come to learn about Connecticut makes them really curious. And so they start going into Hartford, for example. The African American churches sometimes would send transportation to the farms to go and pick up the workers, bring them into Hartford. Dr. King talked about coming into Hartford, but they had way more supervision because the Morehouse folks were with them because they were boys. And I call those reconnaissance missions, right? They leave the farm and they come to Hartford. This is really important because if you're like in Hamburg, Pennsylvania, yeah, your reconnaissance mission is going to take you to another little tiny Pennsylvania town that you probably don't want to live in either. But the reconnaissance mission to Hartford leads to this attraction, right? There's a small African American community here. They're not lots of the men talk about the workers not being friendly, but the community that they find here is very friendly. And so I would say that the shade tobacco growers played a really important role in creating the opportunities that provide West Indians with an outpost here in Hartford. They have an outpost in New York, they have an outpost in Florida. And Florida and New York are always going to be the biggest draw for West Indians. But Connecticut is a tiny state, and we have the third largest Jamaican population outside of New York and Florida. And that's precisely because of those reconnaissance tours. The men would leave, they would come to Hartford, and then they started looking around. They had some not so wonderful experiences, and they decided that they wanted to create a club. Some of the men stayed over their contracts. So one of the things that you do as a Jamaican guy in the tobacco fields is make sure the African American women you meet know that you have your eyes set on a house. That as soon as you can save up enough money, you're going to buy a house. And so a lot of Jamaican men married African American women, and when they tell their stories, I've interviewed a few of them, they say that they felt like they were going to be economically secure with these West Indian men because they were so obsessed with buying houses when they came to Hartford. And so the first few men venture off the farm. If you are married to an American woman, and you can get your citizenship in about 5 years. And so they're able to get their citizenship, and that is the beginning of an early West Indian community here. The Puerto Rican workers do the same thing, but it's a slightly different pattern because a lot of folks are going back and forth to New York. I saw a lot of people going back and forth to Chicago as well. And people have family networks in the Northeast so that when they sometimes use the tobacco growers for transportation only, you could tell those were the ones who got off the plane and didn't have any luggage. And it took the growers just a couple of trips like that to realize, yeah, they're not going to stay for the season. And they would join their family members. But eventually, people started trickling into Hartford. And in this way, the Puerto Rican population, the African American population, and the West Indian population grows together to become the majority of the city. And shade tobacco is a really important part of that. Now, the last few things that I want to say is that Puerto Rico's Migration Division oversaw the farm labor program in a way that no other country supervised their nationals. So in addition to everything from recruitment to contract negotiations and following up on housing, working conditions, pay, health, they did everything. So they did orientations they picked up people at the airport. They did orientations at the airport. When people complained that the recruiters told them that they were going to be with their cousins or their fathers or their uncles, they tried to convince them to stay and to say, shade tobacco is the entire Tobacco Valley. We didn't promise you one specific farm. They tried to convince those workers who were a bit confused. They bailed people out of jail. They set up English classes. They repatriated people who had emergencies in Puerto Rico. They repatriated people who were having medical emergencies here and needed to go home. They were social workers, they were ministers, they were advisors and counselors. They played a really important role in trying to facilitate and not help the workers navigate their experience here. And although a lot of the workers in the archives criticize the migration division, I think that's probably one of the best examples of labor migration and supervision that I've ever seen. The Jamaican government tries to do something similar, but their apparatus just looks nothing like the migration division. On my opening slide, I will fast forward to that, and I will finish here. On my opening slide, I have this trunk, which has made a circuitous journey from Windsor, Connecticut to Louisiana, back to Jamaica, and then on a plane back to Bradley to me. And this trunk belonged to Donald Dorman. His name is on here. And he came to the United States in 1940, like many thousands of the Jamaican immigrants who joined him at that time during the boom years. He was assigned to Windsor. He has all kinds of, he had all kinds of stories about his life in Windsor that he shared with his family. He went back to Jamaica, and like Dr. King, I suppose, I should say, I wasn't going to talk about that, but like Dr. King, we didn't know, we knew that he had other dreams. He harbored other dreams, and his dream was to take tobacco money, leverage it, and figure out what he was going to do back home, because he planned on coming back for other seasons, but he wasn't going to migrate permanently to the US. He saved his money, he bought a bunch of farm animals, he bought a shop, and he set himself up in Jamaica. He came back in 1950, and he did such a good job with the growers he was working with that they lent him out to other growers. So he headed down to Louisiana to work in sugarcane. This artifact is one of the few pieces remaining, or one of the few that I have, to tell the kind of stories that I'm interested in. The things that went into this trunk were always clothes that were never appropriate for for the Connecticut weather. You can't buy anything in Jamaica to prepare for coming here. But he soon filled it with the right kind of clothing for Connecticut's weather. And when he was going back home to his family, he filled it with all kinds of things. His family doesn't remember exactly what kinds of things, but the other kinds of things I saw in for other migrants include like American clothing, lots of soap, and sometimes food products. And I'm trying to imagine what are all the other artifacts that I can use to try to tell some of the stories from the workers' perspectives. So for those of you who are listening online, if you have ideas, if you have artifacts, by all means, please alert me to them. Otherwise, I am left with the 5,000 pages of the Puerto Rican Migration Division archive as the only entry point. Despite that, as the only entry point, workers wrote all the time. They contacted the Migration Division representatives. They asked for assistance with everything. If someone cursed at them and they were deeply offended, they complained about that. If they were promised a wage rate and they didn't get it, they complained about that. When Coleman Brothers intentionally mistreated the workers so that they would leave, so that they wouldn't have to pay for their transportation in the contract, they wrote about that. When they wanted to go back home because a family member was having an emergency, they wrote about that. So although the stories are really hard to find in between all of those thousands of pages, they are there. And there's not a lot of work being done because it's microfilm and it's really hard to read 5,000 pages on microfilm. So Elena and I are doing it, and we need company, so I welcome one and all. For these workers, tobacco drew them into so many things. For some, it was a novel experience. For some, it was this bridge to meet other people. For West Indians and Puerto Ricans, it was an opportunity to plant a seed here in the city of Hartford. Sometimes you found a wife. Sometimes it was mostly just a lover, but sometimes a wife. You found a lot of friends, and you were able to build a social network. And a little bit later on, West Indians and Puerto Ricans are able to build their own community organizations, to establish their businesses here in Hartford, to set up some of their own churches here. And when they think back and they talk about their experiences in tobacco, they talk about some of the growers who became their children's godfathers. They talk about some of the growers who helped to pay for their kids' tuition. They talk about growers who flew down for weddings. And so, in this space where labor is vulnerable, deportable, where they're stuck in this system of seasonal shortage and relying on guest workers, it is possible for people to develop individual relationships that's not just about vulnerability and exploitation. And I will leave it there. Okay.
So we have time for questions. If you have a question in the room, please wait for the microphone to come to you. If you're online, you can type your questions in and we can address them.
Thank you. You had mentioned about the Jamaicans and the Puerto Ricans coming here in the 1940s. How did they physically come here? Did they take by boat or by ship all the way to, say, New York, or did they only go as far as Miami and take the train, or whatever way?
It's kind of like that song, that movie, right? Planes, trains, automobiles. So specifically during the war, when they were worried about like German sinking their boats, they would go as far as they could. Sometimes they would go to New Orleans and then come overland. Post-war, so the Puerto Ricans are flying here to Bradley, and the recruiters are meeting them at the airport, and then they're taking buses and bringing them here. But workers have, when they're being lent to other harvests, workers have taken the train. Some people have disembarked in New Haven and have and then taken a bus here. So every mechanism, planes, trains, and automobiles. Yeah. Yes.
I just wondered if the Coleman brothers were notorious for mistreat. Are they farmers or a company or what?
Right. So the way that the industry is set up is that you have like Consolidated Cigar and Coleman Brothers, and so they are big corporations, and they own a lot of land, and they would, for their individual operations, so they would farm several thousand acres, but then they would sublet land to some farmers, but then they bought, when the harvest was over, no matter how many farmers there were, though almost those two corporations bought all the tobacco. And then they have outfits in Puerto Rico as well. Sometimes they would recruit workers. They would recruit workers from areas in Puerto Rico where they were settled and send them here on their operations. But that that statement that I made about the Coleman brothers, that's from the Migration Division archives. And of all the growers, right? Of all the growers, the ones who were farming 1,500, acres, or the ones who were doing 300 acres or 500 acres, the smaller family farms, of all the growers, they are the ones who got the most complaints. They got complaints specifically about bringing workers in contractually for one set of work and then setting them to do something else. So maybe they come in to work on the harvest, but then they're sent to the warehouse. Maybe they would come in for the warehouse, but then they would be sent to do nursery work. They would be lent out for nursery, to work in nurseries. And they played around every single year in the archive. The labor rate went up. Sometimes it went up simply because the officials were negotiating for it to go up, or because the Department of Labor or Congress had set new labor rates for agricultural workers. There were a couple of interventions like that, and no matter what contract the shade tobacco growers signed ahead of time, Coleman brothers tried to wheedle out of different aspects of it. So the workers complained that the supervisors at Coleman brothers were few and far between, that whenever there was a problem, there was hardly anybody to talk to, but that this was deliberate because Coleman brothers, depending on what was going on with the season, would look at their bottom line and say, if these 80 Puerto Ricans leave, we don't have to pay their transportation back. And that's going to save us money. There are complaints. There are other complaints, but they're not grower specific. So there's complaints about food. There's lots of complaints about food, about how West Indians like to use butter and Puerto Ricans want lard in their rice and peas, things that are not grower specific, right? There are lots of complaints, but Coleman brothers by far, they're the ones who seem to be intentionally trying to get people to leave their contracts and are not abiding by what they signed. Yes, Paul. Sorry, Paul.
Thanks, Fiona. Our friend Don Rogers, who's watching online on Facebook and participating there, has a question for you. It's a two-part question. First, Don is asking, what protective labor laws, if any, apply to the guest workers from the Caribbean? And second, was there different coverage for Puerto Rican versus Jamaican workers?
So, the short answer to the question is yes. There are different laws covering Puerto Ricans because they're American citizens, and they can violate their contract whenever they want. Somebody can just come and pick them up from a family member can come and pick them up on the farm. And so that was their primary escape hatch. I can't recite all of the laws, like Public Law 78, for example, which was one of them. But between the 1940s, the peak of this production, into the 1970s, there is a steady stream of laws that are introduced. Sometimes it's by congressional action to guarantee minimum working conditions around housing, for example, for workers. Sometimes it's by the state of Connecticut. So there are a series of interventions. One of the most important are some policies that were passed around migrant health interventions, and Connecticut created a really great migrant agricultural health policy, so that folks were, you could come in and get routine medical care, and that was pretty advanced at the time given what was going on. And it didn't matter who you were; anybody could go, whether you were West Indian or Puerto Rican. There were no protections there were no legal protections for the British West Indians except what was embedded in the contract. So every year they negotiate a minimum wage. Sometimes it involves piecework, so you might be able to get a little bit more. You got paid more if you worked. There were other policies where if you got sent out to nurseries or warehouses, like your pay would be negotiated. But you had minimum food requirements, you had minimum housing requirements. That is not to say they were all met. In fact, in the Puerto Rican case, it's precisely because those minimum requirements were not met that the migration division, that led to the migration division being created to help supervise. The growers slowly adjusted to try to please some of the workers. So I know specifically for the West Indian workers, this is not in the contract that they're going to get access to a cricket field, for example, but they go to New York, they get all of the equipment that they need to play cricket, and the men are allowed to play cricket. There's even exhibition matches here in Hartford, and the mayor comes out and throws her pitch, for example, and there's a welcome match and a farewell match. So those were good days. Workers come into town and we don't know they're here. They're invisible. So they would come in and they would have those exhibition matches, and it would be a big to-do, and there would be a huge picnic, and then there would be a farewell and a big to-do and a picnic. And then buses would be sent for the workers, and they would go to churches, and they might have other picnics, especially if it was like really rainy and they couldn't harvest anything. That doesn't really happen anymore. They come, and they're probably about to head out now in November, and we don't know that they were ever here. So things have shifted, maybe not for the better for West Indian workers.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. And I love the idea of using and looking at the history of shade tobacco to explore an entire sociocultural, economic element of a diaspora. And I don't really know that I have a question except for to something that I kept thinking about while you were talking, is that this migration of West Indians to be brought up to work in New England, and in particular Connecticut, is almost the full circle of engagement with the African diaspora of the West Indies trade that Connecticut is so heavily involved in. I mean, we are providing the bulk of materials to the West Indies to maintain the sugar trade. And so this is like the whole reversal of Connecticut's engagement with an economy in a different way, though. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
No, I was when I was working on this talk, there was so much information. I was thinking of that as a potential entry point, and then I thought, well, everybody's talking about Dr. King. I should talk about Dr. King. But yeah, the entire provisioning of the sugar industry, and I think it's really apt, because it means that the West Indies have been a part of the Connecticut imagination for a very long time, and that gaze has shifted, right? That gaze has shifted from provisioning to now they're the third largest. Now they're the third largest Jamaican population and the largest foreign-born population in the state, and everybody outside of New York and Florida is really shocked to hear that. And I think that demographic designation is going to stay with us, because the kinds of communities that West Indians formed here is one that encourage people to come back, right? Because people come, they buy homes, and that keeps you rooted, right, in a place. They set up a business, that keeps you rooted in a place, that keeps the second generation rooted in a place. And so it's not this community that is going to, sort of dissipate. I think it's a community that's going to continue to grow. Bloomfield has turned into a Jamaican town. Windsor wants to turn into a Jamaican town as well. So as those opportunities open up, I think this part of the state, at least, is going to continue to be very West Indian. And one of the things that really surprised me in the interviews for this project is that the way that people talk about Puerto Rico and Jamaica, like rural Puerto Rico, rural Jamaica, and rural Connecticut, that like you can get a house with a big backyard, and it can kind of feel like home. New York is not for everyone. That's what folks said. Like, there's some people who love New York, and there's some people who are like, you visit and you leave and you go and you try to find open space. And they associate Connecticut with that open space and a little bit more of that rural feel. And that's what keeps people rooted here. Their family networks, their business networks, and the landscape, strange as it is that this cold place reminds people of home. Sorry, there's something online.
Sure. So we've got some questions coming in from online participants. So we'll go back and forth between online and live audience questions and try to alternate that way. This question coming from Aaron, who's watching on Facebook. And Aaron is asking, did anything change when Jamaica gained independence from the UK in 1962?
Did anything change? Not really in terms of the labor supply. So instead of Great Britain playing an outsized role in negotiating the contract and telling the American government that, having stepped up and helped them in the war effort, they should not treat their subjects the way that they treat Black people down south. Besides that, the Jamaican government, the independence government of Jamaica, the post-independence government, steps up, and they're the ones who are negotiating. They're the ones who are negotiating the contract. So nothing fundamentally changes about the labor contracts or the position of the West Indies. Jamaicans are still preferred. I will continue to emphasize that they're preferred because they're deportable, but they're also preferred because of their work ethic, and they're preferred because there are, notwithstanding this hierarchical relationship, there are lots of people who've been able to really gain a foothold. Last year at the West Indian Social Club, we were talking about working on a project where we were looking at multi-generational migration and looking at like fathers and sons who, fathers who've sort of handed over the mantle to their sons or their nephews because they had forged a good relationship with a grower. And that grower then requests them year after year after year, and they've negotiated a good working relationship.
Have you been able to research and discover anybody who's still alive who came and was an immigrant into Hartford and worked through the 47, say, maybe they came when they were 10 years old or something?
Wait, that's two different questions. Workers?
Anybody who's still alive who's maybe 98 years old or 88, God willing, who could talk to you about whose family did this and who can tell you
lots
a
of
verbal
people.
history, like
So those, yes. The short answer is yes. There are lots of folks. Luckily, I interviewed them before they were much older. So a few of them are still around. at the West Indian Social Club.
And then my second question is, did you, in all of your research, did you find any reason or facts supporting or not supporting why Connecticut never took out a patent for the broadleaf to wrap cigars, and why we lost our financial, you know what, derriere on not having a patent?
I have not, but I think that when you are, I think when you're experimenting with genetic varieties, I don't really think you can patent that. Because right before shade took off, right? And the Sumatra leaf was all the rage aesthetically. Connecticut then was experimenting with like Cuban varieties, Sumatran varieties, and perhaps you want to fill in for me. But those were things that were done at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. There's nothing to stop Cuba or Costa Rica from engaging in their own genetic experiments and figuring out how to grow tobacco, right? It's under shade here because of our climate conditions, right? To make sure that we can control the moisture and the humidity and to duplicate, sorry, this is the guy that I interviewed, who's 93, by the way. I don't know how to make this thing stop. So I don't know that you can patent that and prevent it from being grown anywhere, because then they would just go and experiment with something from Sumatra.
Something I had read somewhere, they mentioned this, it was a problem.
Well, it's a labor problem. It's not a patent problem, because everybody is chasing labor. Everybody's chasing cheap labor, right? So whatever labor rate you pay guest workers here, you're not going to pay that. You're not going to pay that in Costa Rica. And even for the, say, like the Consolidated Cigar and the other corporations here, they are growing tobacco in Puerto Rico and they're not paying those labor rates. So as long as growers of any kind of crop, any kind of agricultural crop, are going to look for cheap, pliable labor, this is the problem, not the patent. There's Mr. Bennett again. he's the one that I interviewed. Another Paul.
Thanks, Fiona. So another question coming from a Facebook viewer, Tammy Denise, is writing in and asking, do we know how many workers came and how many stayed and became citizens?
So the entire West Indian population of Connecticut in 1950, in the 1950 census, is 250 people. Now, not all 200, and that's across the entire Connecticut, entire state. Most of them, of course, are on this side of the state. So if that's the aggregate number for everyone, I would say somewhere under 200 and 250. There are, the West Indian Social Club was founded in the 1950s, and it quickly grew to about 300. Here's another gentleman who worked in tobacco. It quickly grew to about 300 members, and a lot of those folks had farm worker ties as well. So I would say somewhere in the, I would guess a little bit under 250, because that's what the census found. But this completely changes after 1965, right? Because after 1965, there is immigration reform that where the quota system that used to restrict West Indians from just migrating on their own, the quota system falls away, and there's a different kind of immigration after 65, and it's families and it's women and children There's immigration reform under Reagan in '86, and again, that's actually family reunification is a big part of that immigration reform policy, and that brings a lot of West Indians here who didn't necessarily come by way of tobacco, and so now there's about like 80,000 folks in the region. Dan? Here's one of the late.
I have about a dozen questions, but
1,000 questions.
but because you were sort of juxtaposing the Puerto Rican pipeline with the West Indian pipeline, I'm curious. It seems to me that the societies that have developed here among West Indian folks and among Puerto Rican folks are quite different. I'm curious whether you have attempted to figure out what the difference in the dynamics were there.
I don't know what you mean by. I find a lot of comment. Maybe I'll answer by saying, I don't think that they were that different, because I find a lot of commonalities in their migration patterns, right? So just like Jamaicans, Florida and New York are sort of the two big centers of migration. And then folks go off to secondary cities like Hartford. But when Puerto Ricans are leaving the farm and they're coming into the city, their hopes and their dreams look very much like the West Indians. They want to find a place to live, and they confront a very segregated city, and so they get hemmed into like the Clay Arsenal area, right? The West Indians get hemmed into the North End, right? But they are having similar kinds of experiences. They establish similar kinds of businesses. There's a huge tradition of community organizing that Puerto Ricans have, that they bring with them from Puerto Rico, and they reestablish here in the city. A tremendous amount of that looks like what we would call social work and community development, and that fans out among the Puerto Rican population here. West Indians do the same thing. At one time, they had like 14 social organizations devoted to each island, or to police officers, or to women, or their Masonic lodges. So I don't necessarily see that they've gone in different directions, and the way that they've chosen to like engage in ethnic politics looks very similar as well. So maybe, what are the differences that you see?
Well, I was thinking specifically about the institutions. It seems to me that within the West Indian community in Hartford, there are more like formalized institutions, whether it's the West Indian Social Club or groups like that I don't so much see among Latino folks, and whether that's a difference in the culture they came from, or whether I'm blind or.
No. So although Puerto Ricans will tell you that they're from Cidras, or Aguas Buenas, or Aguadilla, it's still all one Puerto Rico. Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Bayesians, as soon as they get their independence, they want their own. And so I would say that's what leads to sort of the splintering into all of these different kinds of organizations. There's lots of Black newspapers who make all kinds of jokes about, as soon as a West Indian figures out that he can be the leader of something, he's going to go create his own club, even if there's like 3 members of it. So I think there's a lot more unity, even lots of regional identity and pride among Puerto Ricans, but it's still one island, whereas all the different islands want to have their own The West Indian Social Club is colloquially called the Jamaican Social Club because it's mostly Jamaicans. There's Mr. Dorman looking very dapper and not like a farm worker at all. So I am aware that it's 7:05. We could talk forever. Okay, all right.
How you doing? I think you've been answering this question. I'll ask you it more directly. Could you talk about how the civil rights movement, because 1940 and 1970, the U.S. civil rights movement happens, how that might have impacted the tobacco growers industry, as well as you mentioned in your opening talking about redlining in the city, and I was hoping you could talk more about that.
You can't end with those gigantic questions. Civil rights and when the West Indian Social Club was created in 1950, it quickly becomes the magnet for any kind of organizing that West Indians want to do. And although they're accused of being like clannish and focused on their own group, they quickly assimilate into the politics of Blackness, right? So while they're deeply committed to maintaining their culture, their heritage, their food, their music, their dance, etc., and their own social spaces, their politics don't look very different. And somebody like a Colin Bennett, for example, who becomes a councilman, right, and is a real estate agent, and so he's been on the front lines of the problems that the Puerto Rican, the African American, and the West Indian community is having in the city of Hartford, which is deep problems with housing. So Puerto Ricans are being discriminated against because, you know, folks are saying like, we don't want all of your children. You have such large families, right? We don't even want to rent to you, even if a rental is available. All three groups are paying astronomical proportions of their income to housing, which all housing advocates are talking about now, right? Because the housing is terrible, their housing access is terrible, but they don't have anywhere to go. And so landlords are able to jack up the prices simply because the supply it can't meet the demand. So the West Indian organizations and the Puerto Rican organizations, they all are focused on this particular issue of housing as a major part of their civil rights advocacy. And then precisely because of the problems that Puerto Ricans have, they're focused on bilingual education as a major part of their advocacy, because those rights just were not enmeshed in our education system. I think we take them for granted. We take them for granted now, but they were not. Maria Colon Sanchez and other activists have had to fight for that, and have had to, the same way that like school board elections have gotten politicized this season, right? They were making sure that they were cultivating folks to join the school board and to push for advocacy for bilingual education, which then benefits all kinds of immigrants. Because now in Hartford public schools and other public schools across the country, you know, it doesn't matter. It's not just about Spanish language education anymore. It's about bilingual education that can address any immigrant group. And so we should be really grateful for those kinds of civil rights advances. So I am going to leave it there. I'm just going to say, so at CaribbeanMosaics.com, you can go hog wild and check out the West Indian stories. The Puerto Rican stories are under development. So I will have Jeff keep you guys posted if you're on the waiting list, but it's called CaribbeanMosaics.com, and it's a website whose goal is to document the experiences of Puerto Ricans and West Indians and African Americans in the city of Hartford. And yeah, there will be more to come. There are lots of stories there that you can check out, ones I didn't get to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. So we appreciate that fascinating lecture, and thank you for the question and answer time. We do hope that you'll come out to Spring Grove and Faith Congregational Church for our November 13th tour, and join us back here on the 18th for our final program or final lecture of the series. Thank you very much and have a good night.